where are the inefficiencies, how they can try and get a bit more bang for their buck. So at the moment, the ministries of education are receiving the highest portion of the budget. They're getting about 20% of the national budget, which is brilliant, but we're not seeing that quality outcomes that that high portion of the budget would suggest you should be seeing. So the public expenditure review was to try to understand what's going on and to try and figure out how we can improve on efficiencies. So essentially, the spending structure in our education system is skewed. The majority of your kids are in primary school, and then they're dropping out as you move up the education levels. But our spending is the other way around. You have a lot of money for tertiary. Our secondary school kids are getting a lot of funding. Primary school less so. Pre-primary and ECD, almost nothing. Pre-primary gets 2% of the education budget. So like I showed you, we have our grade 1 children repeating. So essentially, you're starting with a weak foundation, and then you're trying to fix it as you move up. So you're putting more and more money into trying to fix the cracks that are already there. So what we need to see in Namibia to make a big impact and to try to improve on equality in education is a lot more emphasis put on access and quality of the primary years, but even before that, access and quality of ECD and pre-primary. Because if you don't have your basic numeracy and your basic literacy, your early emotional development that teaches you not to bully, not to hit, not to commit suicide if you don't pass grade 10. It teaches you your concentration skills, your fine motor skills, all these things that children need in order to build on that foundation they get in those early years. So we often see children who have nothing before grade 1, and when they go into grade 1, they can't hold a pencil, and they've never been taught to, for example, be in an environment where you have to share your resources. So that's a big challenge that we have in Namibia. Some interventions and recommendations. So in 2015, we did an out-of-school children study, which was, I think, a very good start to understand who's dropping out of school, why, what are the push and pull factors. So that's helped UNICEF, but also the Ministry of Education to start to structure their interventions. We've also just helped the ministry conduct a public expenditure review, which I mentioned, and that has a lot of exciting recommendations to try and balance out some of the inequalities in education. So one of the things that this review recommends is to shift our focus from school hostels, which are costly. They take children away from homes early on. There's a huge opportunities for abuse and neglect within hostels, et cetera, and to rather put that money towards school transport, so that we try and zone in on the remote and rural schools and rather focus on transporting kids to and from school where they still have their home environment. And then you can have hopefully see a reduction in that huge dropout from the rural and remote schools. Another thing is to look at staffing norms. We have very irregular class sizes across the country. So if we can try and balance out some of our learner-teacher ratios, that'll help to then also balance out the very staffing-heavy Ministry of Education bill. A lot of the funds are spent on just the teacher salaries. Also, there was a recommendation to relook at the grants of private schools. Private school grants were put in place to try and address inequalities, to try and ensure that children from previously disadvantaged backgrounds had an opportunity of benefiting from private school education. But this public expenditure review found that that wasn't really working. It was more subsidizing already privileged children's education. And then to look at the Ministry of Education have a system where they incentivize teachers to go and work in rural and remote schools. But what this recommended was rather focus on teacher housing, because this is an example of a teacher's house just outside Uchu in Serenkop, and this is somebody who had made their way through grade 12, had passed all those hurdles, had gone to university, had got into debt to pay for university, qualified as a teacher. Obviously, once you're a graduate in Namibia, you should be quite an in-demand asset, but he wanted to teach, he went into this job, and then you end up in a house like that. It's kind of a disincentive to go down that path. So rather than incentivizing with funds, rather invest in teacher housing closer to schools to try and bring qualified teachers to the rural areas. And then another recommendation from the public expenditure review was to make sure that the EMIS, so the Education Management Information System data, is compared with the payroll data to make sure you don't have teachers in the system who aren't in the schools. And the Ministry of Education has already done this. In the first year of this recommendation, they did so, and they managed to save themselves, straight off the back, 24 million. So that was great and positive. Another thing, like I mentioned, we really need to shift our focus and our interventions into ECD and early years. This graph just shows you, these are the optimum years for brain development and learning. This is before, at the age of 4, you're already starting to see a dip off in your optimum early learning. So we really need to make sure that we're catching kids in those early years. And then another thing that we need to focus on, there's a lot of non-academic things that are pushing children out of the education system. So things like health and safety issues. We have a big problem with corporal punishment in schools still. We still have a big problem with violence in our communities, which of course is like our schools are a microcosm of the community, so we're going to have violence there. If you have children who have come to school who haven't had a meal, who haven't been dewormed, who have traumatic symptoms from sexual abuse or whatever else, we need to have systems in schools that can address with some of the health and safety issues that could otherwise push children from the system. And these two programs are something that UNICEF are working very closely with the Ministry of Education in scaling up and institutionalizing, and they're going extremely well. Another issue that we're looking into is our examination and assessment system. It's currently possibly a push factor from the education system because we're not assessing for learning. We're assessing in a sort of punitive measure. So we need to make sure that this system is more tuned in order to help children respond to their mistakes and learn properly. And this is something that we're also working on, looking at an assessment of this. And then one of the things that we really need is improved data. We need improved indicators, more disaggregation, but also a learner tracking system so we can see who's dropping out and where. And also interoperability of data. So if the Ministry of Health data can speak to the Ministry of Education's data, that can speak to the Ministry of Gender's data, so we know this child has been in ECD and they're progressing through the system, and if they get lost, where have they gone? Similarly with teachers. And that is where I will end. And then if we have any questions afterwards, we'll take them from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. I think let's give her another round of applause. That was incredibly interesting and also quite depressing, to be honest. That's okay, I'll comment and so on a little bit later on all of that. I would like to welcome our next speaker, Paik Bruns from Steps for Children. Please give him a round of applause.
Morning. I believe it's a panel, so I'm just as comfortable down here. I don't think I have to stand up there. We've had the information speaker who has provided so very ably and interestingly facts and figures. So I feel that it is our task now to talk to perhaps some of the figures, but also to share some ideas. And, you know, you would ask, why is Paik? I ask, you don't ask. I ask, why does Paik sit on that panel? I mean, there are such honorable and senior educationalists in the audience, and they should probably be much better equipped to address this issue than me. However, I want to thank the organizers to ask a non-teacher and a non-educationalist and a non-person out of the sector to talk to education, because there are issues which I think are severely wrong, not only underlined by the figures presented just now, but also known to all of us as we are either coming out of school, or we are in school, or we are having children who are in school. I am running a leadership development program for 15 years. It's a year-long program which equips young leaders with a greater ability to understand or appreciate their role in life as citizens of this country. And I'll speak against the background of learnings there. I don't want to do away with the commonly shared notion that education is being the greatest equalizer in an unequal world. And I think we have to live up to the fact that demographically the vast majority of our society is young. In terms of inequality, this is further complicated by the fact that many of our young people grow up in rural areas. On top of that, The rural areas are the segment of society which is mostly and most significantly marginalized. At the same time, we are priding ourselves with stating whenever we can that public spending on education is approximately just above 8% of GDP, and that is most certainly above sort of what your international guide would offer. My background is in organization development, and I want to just with one sentence, I want to state that despite talking about education now, I very firmly believe that weak institutions and weak organizations are the root cause to be discussed when discussing inequality. But we are talking education, and I want to zoom in on this topic at hand. Increasingly, it is now generally acknowledged that emotional intelligence, and I think that's also been a bit of a recommendation just now, emotional intelligence has particular relevance to the notion of whole person development, as the role of emotions and emotional intelligence has been duly recognized in personal growth and development. The educators amongst you might be skeptical as to the importance of this as compared to traditional IQ, and you may raise the question on whether emotional intelligence meets the criteria or standards as an intelligence. However, emotional intelligence, in my view and to my experience, should warrant the full attention of educators in school practice. In fact, huge volumes of academic studies demonstrate the predictive power of scientific emotional intelligence assessments vis-à-vis job performances, leadership potential, entrepreneurship, employability. Moreover, the importance of EQ has been highlighted beyond work-related settings, as higher scores have been associated with relationship success, mental and physical health, and happiness. Daniel Goleman, some of you may be